All right, so are you ready to dive into some seriously fascinating history?
Always. What are we looking at today?
Today we're going to tackle the history of sex and relationships during the agrarian era.
Ooh, very nice.
You know, I figured you'd like this one.
Yeah, this is right up my alley.
You sent over this chapter from A Brief History of Sex, and it is packed
Oh, yeah.
with insights. Like, I was really blown away by this.
It's a really interesting period because you're really seeing a shift in how humans kind of interact with each other, and in the move from foraging to farming.
Yeah, and that's really what we're trying to unpack today, right?
Absolutely.
How did this shift to agriculture completely transform human sexual practices, beliefs, societal norms?
The what and the why.
Yeah, and I think the why is where things get really juicy.
It is, yeah.
So, okay, let's paint a picture for our listener.
Okay.
Imagine you're a forager, living in a small band, you're nomadic, you're moving with the seasons. Food is plentiful.
Yeah, life's pretty good.
Pretty chill, right? Now, fast forward a few thousand years.
Okay.
Bam, you're an early farmer.
Right.
You are tied to a piece of land. You're working sun up to sundown to make sure your crops thrive.
Right, and that's a very different way of life.
Yeah. How do you think that changes things?
I mean, if you think about it, your entire life revolves around this one very specific plot of land.
Right.
That land becomes your livelihood, your entire legacy.
And your families too, right?
Exactly. And so suddenly things like who you have children with, how many children you have, even who you sleep with,
Yeah.
takes on a whole new meaning.
It's almost like sex becomes less about pleasure.
Less about personal pleasure
Yeah.
and much more about economics.
Yeah, and I'm seeing how that really feels into this idea of paternity and inheritance.
Oh, absolutely.
Which the chapter talks a lot about.
Yeah, paternity becomes this huge concern. Men need to be certain that their offspring are actually theirs.
Right, because they're passing down this land.
Exactly. Inheritance is everything.
So, and that leads to...
much greater control over female sexuality.
Ah, okay.
So you're looking at things like much stricter punishments for adultery,
Yeah.
later ages of marriage,
Oh, interesting.
compared to foragers, because, again, you need to make sure that that lineage is secure.
Right.
And just all sorts of much more complex social rules around sex and relationships in general.
So not exactly a picnic for the women of this era?
No, not necessarily, although I do want to say there's this misconception that, once women become tied to the farm, they just become housewives.
Right.
But life for early farmers was incredibly difficult.
Yeah.
It required all hands on deck.
Right.
So men and women were really working side by side. So
that idea of the housewife
Yeah.
was kind of later development.
oh yeah, that was a luxury for the very wealthy.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. And we're also seeing an increase in family size too, right?
Absolutely. More kids meant more hands to work the land.
Right.
And with this new settled lifestyle, women could actually have many more children than their nomadic ancestors. So it was kind of a population boom,
Wow.
which just further fueled the need for land and resources.
Wow. So, okay, so we're seeing how this is all kind of playing out. But I'm curious, was monogamy the standard back then?
That's where things get really interesting. Not necessarily, while monogamous instincts and societal pressures probably did encourage single partnerships.
Right.
For most people, polygyny was surprisingly common.
Polygyny.
Yeah, where a man has multiple wives.
Oh, wow. So multiple wives, that was a thing.
It was actually pretty widespread.
Huh. Especially among the elites, right?
Especially among the elites, yeah.
I mean, the chapter talks about, pharaohs with these huge harems and
Oh, yeah.
powerful rulers with tons of wives.
Absolutely. And it wasn't just an Egyptian thing. It was
Right.
happening in Mesopotamia, ancient Israel, India, China, all over the place.
It seems like a pretty sweet deal for the guys.
Well, yeah. I mean, for these elite men,
Yeah.
it was a way to consolidate their wealth-secure alliances, solidify their power.
So it wasn't just about satisfying some primal urge.
No.
It was like a power move.
It was a power move. It was about social control.
Wow. Okay, so what about the average Joe back then? Were they all practicing polygyny?
Not really.
Yeah.
It seems that for the majority of the population, monogamy, or at least the aspiration to it, was the norm.
Okay.
And this is where you see those cultural pressures and societal norms coming into play.
So we're kind of wired for both, it seems.
Yeah, exactly.
Monogamy and then this whole range of other possibilities.
Exactly. And it really just depends on the culture that you're in.
Now I gotta ask, what about polyandry?
Polyandry.
Yeah, where a woman has multiple husbands. Did
Right.
that happen at all?
It did, but it was much rarer.
Okay.
There are examples in places like Tibet driven by very specific cultural and environmental
Yeah.
factors, but it definitely challenges our assumptions about, what's considered natural or normal.
Right. It's not just one size fits all.
No, exactly.
Okay, so we've got land ownership, larger families, polygyny among the elites. What was marriage actually like for the average person during this era?
Yeah.
Was it all about like love and romance?
Well, marriage during the agrarian era was less about romantic love and more about practicality.
Ah,
Think of it as a contract, a strategic alliance.
okay, so less love at first sight,
Yeah.
more like merging our plots of land.
Yeah, merging your plots of land for maximum yield.
Okay, I like that.
Very often these unions were arranged by families with bride prices or dowries exchanged.
Now, prices and dowries, I mean, that does not sound very romantic.
No, it was serious business.
Yeah.
And it's important to note that a bride price was paid by the groom's family to the bride's family, while a dowry was the opposite. So assets brought into the marriage by the bride.
Oh, okay, that's interesting. I didn't realize there was a distinction.
Yeah, it depended on the specific cultural context.
Okay, and in some cultures, the situation for women was even more complex.
Oh, absolutely.
Wives were viewed as property, basically.
Yeah, sometimes they were even listed alongside livestock and possessions in legal documents.
Wow, so the Code of Hammurabi, the chapter mentioned that. What did it say about women in marriage?
The Code of Hammurabi, well, that was from ancient Babylon,
Okay.
and it had incredibly specific and often harsh laws regarding women's behavior within marriage.
Okay, for example.
Well, adultery, for example, was a capital
A
offense.
capital offense.
Yeah, punishable by death.
It really makes you realize how far we've come in terms of women's rights.
Yeah, it's a stark reminder.
What other examples did you find in the material of this control over women?
Well, practices like sati in
Thank
India,
you.
yeah, where widows were expected to throw themselves onto their husband's funeral pyres.
Oh my gosh, that's awful.
Yeah, it was a very, very different time and place, and it just highlights how women's lives and bodies were controlled in certain societies.
Yeah, that's heartbreaking.
It is.
Okay, so we're seeing this very like transactional view of marriage. Was there any room for romantic love at all in these marriages?
It's not as black and white as we might think.
Okay.
While practicality was definitely the driving force, the chapter does suggest that romantic love probably still existed.
Okay.
We see hints of it in literature and traditions from various cultures.
Interesting.
And even arranged marriages could and often did evolve into loving and respectful relationships.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that human emotions can't always be contained by like, social structures or
Oh, yes.
rules or whatever.
Love finds a way.
But this contrast, though, between like the agrarian view of marriage and our modern emphasis on like love and individual choice is really striking.
It is. It really highlights how much our understanding of relationships has evolved.
Yeah.
The idea of marriage being primarily a property contract is increasingly rare. Divorce is much more accepted, and romantic love is often the foundation for modern partnerships.
Yeah, it's a long way from bride prices and arranged marriages.
It really is.
Speaking of evolving social norms, I want to talk about something that might surprise our listeners. The experiences of LGBTQIA plus individuals in early civilizations. Yeah.
You might assume that those experiences were completely suppressed during this era,
You might assume that. Yeah.
but it wasn't always the case.
No, it wasn't.
Some early civilizations showed a surprising degree of tolerance, even acceptance.
They did.
Really?
Yeah.
I have to admit, that's not the image I had in mind. What kind of examples did you find?
We'll take Mesopotamia, for instance.
Okay.
They had gala priests.
Gala priests.
Yeah, these were men who dressed and identified as women.
Oh, wow.
And they held important roles in religious rituals going back like 4,500 years.
So they weren't just tolerated, they were like integrated into the religious structure.
It seems that way, at least in that specific context. Now we don't have a complete picture of how trans and non-binary people were treated in everyday Mesopotamian life,
Sure.
but it does challenge the assumption that gender roles were completely rigid back then.
It definitely does.
Yeah.
What about other cultures? Were there similar examples?
Ancient Egypt is another interesting case.
Evidence is limited, but it suggests that homosexuality wasn't explicitly forbidden.
Huh.
There are even hints that some elites engaged in same-sex relationships quite openly.
So there was more fluidity in these early societies than we might expect.
That's a key takeaway. However, it's important to understand that this initial tolerance didn't last.
Oh, okay.
Attitudes shifted over time, often quite dramatically, as the influence of major religions grew.
You're talking about Christianity and Islam, right? I know those faiths have prohibitions against homosexuality.
Yes, Both drew from Jewish tradition, which explicitly condemned homosexuality, and these beliefs became deeply ingrained in the societies they influenced.
So like those Old Testament stories about Sodom and Gomorrah,
Yeah.
the verses in Leviticus, those really started to shape social attitudes.
Exactly, and those ideas were further reinforced by influential figures like St. Paul,
Right.
whose writings in the New Testament also denounce homosexuality.
Yeah.
So these pronouncements had a profound impact on the legal and social landscape.
And you mentioned punishments earlier. What were some of the penalties for same-sex relationships during this time?
They varied widely depending on the time and place, but they could be incredibly harsh.
Like,
Well, you're looking at things like confinement to monasteries, imprisonment, torture, even death.
wow.
And it wasn't just gay men who suffered. Lesbians were also persecuted, often
None.
facing horrific fates.
It's just chilling to think about how religious beliefs can be twisted to justify, violence and oppression.
Sadly, yes.
Oh,
The criminalization of homosexuality driven by these doctrines spread across Europe and beyond as Christianity and Islam expanded their reach.
so for those individuals who did experience same-sex attraction, life must have been terrifying.
It must have been. Yeah, imagine living in a world where your very identity is considered a sin, a crime.
Yeah.
Many LGBTQIA+ individuals during this era were forced to live in secrecy, their relationships hidden from view. Their stories often went unrecorded, lost to history.
It's a tragic loss.
It is.
Well, the chapter did mention something about exceptions among the elites, right?
You're right. Even in the face of these harsh punishments, there were instances where some individuals with power and privilege were able to maintain same-sex relationships,
Okay.
though they had to be incredibly discreet.
It's a reminder that power dynamics often dictate, who can express their sexuality openly and who faces persecution. And it's a pattern that sadly continues to this day in many parts of the world.
Yeah, it does.
Speaking of power dynamics, the source also explores the rise of sex work and pornography during this era.
It does.
Wait, are you saying our ancestors were indulging in those activities too?
Oh,
I
yeah.
always thought those were like modern inventions.
Not at all. Both sex work and pornography have roots that stretch back to the dawn of civilization, and the agrarian era offers some fascinating insights into their early forms and the societal attitudes surrounding them.
Okay, I'm all ears. Tell me more about this ancient sex industry.
Well, the earliest documented instances of sex work come from, perhaps unsurprisingly, Mesopotamia,
Mesopotamia again.
the cradle of civilization. And what's fascinating is that it wasn't just tolerated, it was often intertwined with religious practices.
Hold on, religious prostitution.
Yeah.
I've never heard of that before.
It might sound strange to modern ears, but in some cultures, men and women participated in rituals where they exchanged sex for payment as part of their worship.
Wow.
This sacred prostitution, as it's sometimes called,
Sacred prostitution, okay.
wasn't unique to Mesopotamia either. It popped up in other ancient societies like China, India, and Mesoamerica.
It seems like religion, sex, and power have always been like intertwined in these really complex ways.
Definitely. And it's important to remember that while we have these documented examples of ritualistic sex work, traditional prostitution undoubtedly existed as well.
So brothels, streetwalkers, the whole 9 yards.
Exactly. Accounts from various cultures, including the Middle East, China, India, and the Greco-Roman world, all describe the presence of brothels and streetwalkers.
And just like today, there are probably like different tiers of sex work,
Oh, absolutely.
catering to different social classes and preferences.
Right? Different levels of luxury.
It seems like some things stay remarkably consistent throughout history,
Yeah.
despite societal changes and technological advancements.
It speaks to the enduring nature of certain human desires and needs.
But the story of sex work during the agrarian era isn't just about like pleasure and economics, right?
Right.
It's got a dark side too,
It does.
with human trafficking playing a significant role.
Absolutely. With slavery so prevalent in the ancient world, it's not surprising that it would extend to the sex trade.
Right.
Many sex workers in brothels were slaves, forced into this life against their will. Their earnings went to their owners who profited from their exploitation.
Yeah.
In ancient Rome, for example, selling women into sexual slavery was a common punishment for criminals.
That's awful.
Yeah, it's a sobering reminder of the exploitation and abuse that has always plagued this industry.
So given how societies were tightening their grip on things like polygyny and homosexuality, what was their attitude towards sex work?
Yeah.
Was it seen as immoral?
It's interesting because while attitudes towards polygyny and homosexuality became stricter opinions on sex work, remained fairly consistent.
Oh, so they were okay with it.
It was often seen as a necessary evil, a way to regulate male sexuality and, importantly, prevent adultery with respectable women.
So it was tolerated, even encouraged in some cases, to maintain a certain social order.
Precisely. And this pragmatic stance continued, even as attempts were made to regulate and control the industry.
Okay.
In medieval Europe, for example, there was a push to confine sex workers to designated areas of towns,
Oh, wow.
or to force them to wear identifying clothing.
It seems like society wanted to condemn it morally while also acknowledging its practicality.
Yeah, it's a contradiction we still grapple with today.
Absolutely. No matter how much we try to suppress or control it, the demand persists.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've covered sex work, but what about pornography?
Yes.
Was that really a thing way back then?
Yeah.
I'm having trouble picturing our agrarian ancestors enjoying porn. No internet, no magazines. Were they just drawing on cave walls?
Not quite cave walls, but you're on the right track.
Okay.
In ancient Mesopotamia, we find these depictions of men and women engaged in sexual acts. Now, there's debate about whether these were purely for arousal or had some sort of religious significance.
So it's like trying to decode the meaning behind ancient symbols. Was it art? Was it porn?
Maybe both.
Maybe both.
Yeah,
Okay. And that ambiguity makes it even more fascinating.
it does.
As we move into later periods, the lines become a bit clearer.
They do.
The Greco-Roman world, for example, was much more explicit in its depictions of sexuality.
Oh, yeah.
Now we're talking. Tell me about the Greco-Roman porn.
Well, think murals and sculptures depicting all sorts of erotic acts. Pompeii, in particular, has yielded some eye-opening artwork that wouldn't look out of place in a modern-day adult bookstore.
I had no idea. It sounds like they were pretty open about sexuality, at least in certain contexts.
They certainly were, however. Even in these more open societies, there were still norms and conventions. Well, for instance, Greco-Roman art often depicted men with smaller penises.
Wait, are you saying they had a thing for, well, you know...
Not exactly. It was more about their cultural ideals. A large phallus was seen as bestial, uncivilized.
Oh.
So artists would often downplay that aspect to portray a more refined, controlled masculinity.
That's an interesting detail I never would guess.
Yeah.
And it shows how these seemingly small things can reveal a lot about a culture's values and beliefs.
Absolutely.
Okay, so now the evolution of pornography takes a fascinating turn with the invention of the printing press.
It does.
Ah, yes, the printing press that changed everything, including, it seems, the way people consumed erotica.
Oh, yeah, big time. And China led the way in this area.
China.
Yeah. With the advent of woodblock printing in the 7th century, they began producing illustrated pornography on a scale that was unprecedented.
So they were printing pornographic images and distributing them.
They were.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah.
Were they just drawings or did they include stories as well?
Both early printed erotica included visual depictions and written stories. And it wasn't long before it spread to Japan and Korea.
Wow.
Yeah. And some of the surviving images are incredibly detailed and creative, let's just say.
I can only imagine. What about Europe?
Yeah.
Weren't they a bit more uptight about such things back then?
Well, the printing press arrived in Europe a bit later in the mid-15th century. But once it did, pornography wasn't far behind.
Of course not.
Despite religious objections and social stigma, printing presses were soon churning out erotic content, both visual and written. It seems people's desires couldn't be suppressed.
It's fascinating. It really highlights how humans, regardless of the era or the technology available, have always found ways to express their sexuality and share those experiences.
It truly speaks to the enduring power of those desires, even in the face of social pressure and moral condemnation.
This deep dive into the agrarian era has been an eye-opener.
It has.
We've covered the impact of agriculture on marriage and family structures, the complexities of LGBTQIA+ experiences, and the surprisingly long history of sex work and pornography. It's been quite a journey. What stands out to you as the most surprising or insightful discovery?
I think for me, what's really fascinating is how adaptable human sexual behavior is.
Yeah.
You know, despite all the constraints and challenges of this era,
Right.
we see this remarkable range of practices and expressions.
Yeah, it's like we're programmed for both monogamy and then this whole spectrum of other possibilities.
That's
Then
exactly.
our culture kind of determines which path we end up taking.
It does, yeah. The agrarian era, with its focus on property lineage and social control, definitely steered a lot of societies toward that more restrictive model.
Yeah, but even within those limitations, human desires found a way to surface.
It did.
Whether it was through, secret relationships or ritualistic practices or artistic expressions.
Right.
Our ancestors navigated those complexities in ways that I think we're only beginning to understand.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It makes you reconsider those assumptions that we often have about the past, you know, and recognize that human sexuality has always been diverse and complex.
Okay, so we've explored how land ownership impacted relationships, the rise of these patriarchal systems, the intricacies of marriage, the experiences of LGBTQIA plus individuals, and the surprisingly ancient history of sex work and pornography.
Yeah, it's been quite a journey.
It really has, but what does it all mean for us today?
Right.
Why should we care about what happened, thousands of years ago?
Well, I think understanding this past allows us to critically examine our own societal norms
Yeah.
and appreciate the long and winding road we've traveled to get to where we are today.
Right.
The agrarian era, in a lot of ways, laid the groundwork for so many of the beliefs and practices that we still see today.
So you're saying like those ingrained ideas about monogamy, the control over women's sexuality, even our attitudes towards sex work and pornography,
Absolutely.
we can trace those threads back to this period.
Right. Those anxieties about paternity property and social control, they're still there,
Wow.
just below the surface, influencing our cultural narratives.
It's like we're looking into a distorted mirror, seeing those age-old anxieties reflected back at us.
Exactly. And by understanding those historical forces, we can gain a deeper understanding of how we arrived at our current social landscape.
Okay.
It allows us to question assumptions, challenge outdated beliefs, and hopefully create a more informed and equitable future.
That's a powerful insight.
It's not just about looking back. It's about using that knowledge to move forward.
It's about progress.
It is, yeah.
So we've been talking about how agriculture shaped sexuality,
We have.
but I'm curious, did it go the other way too?
That's a great question.
Did evolving sexual practices and beliefs, in turn, influence the development of agrarian societies?
I think so.
It's a two-way street.
It is, yeah.
Yeah.
How did that shift away from polygyny, for example, or the growing influence of these religious doctrines impact the way those societies function?
It just highlights the dynamic interplay between these forces, and it's something that we're still grappling with today.
Absolutely. History isn't static.
No.
It's about understanding that ongoing dialogue between our past, present, and future.
Well said for our listeners who are, eager to delve deeper into this fascinating subject.
Yeah,
There's a wealth of information out there.
there is.
The chapter you shared is just the tip of the iceberg.
It is. Keep exploring.
Keep questioning and keep those brains buzzing.
Absolutely.